Welcome to Novara Live. We're back in the studio. The fans are on. The computer is back up and running. Service, as usual, has resumed. I should also give you some behind-the-scenes information. Rick, one of our producers, has been today. I don't know, to me it looks like he's sort of covering windows with tin foil. I'm sure something different is happening, sort of in reality, but that's all I can see. And I think the hope is that when the heat wave comes back next week, we will still be able to, or this time we'll be able to do a show in the studio. But for now, this week, we're definitely fine because it doesn't get crazy until next Monday. I'm joined by Barry Malone.
Hello, Michael.
How was your heat wave? Did you make the most of it, or were you sort of...
No, I hid in my house with blankets over the windows, fanning myself like crazy. So no, I didn't really enjoy it. But I do have a complaint about the fans in here.
Oh.
It's blowing my hair all over the place.
It's blowing your hair all over the place, yeah.
This can't stand.
Well, you're not wearing a toupee at least.
I mean, nearly.
We'll get you some hair gel to sort of make that a bit more solid.
Thank you very much.
Tonight we are talking about Andy Burnham. He's laid out his plans for devolving power away from Westminster. He's said that over the next decade, very soon actually, there will be a number 10 for the North, but over the next decade there will be growth in every postcode. That's the idea. Donald Trump, after the ceasefire with Iran looking like it might break down, he is now sort of out of the blue again announced fresh peace talks with Iran. And we discussed the rise of Democratic Socialism in the United States. Lots to discuss. Also, actually, a new report into the underperformance of white working class boys in secondary schools. Some quite stark statistics, actually. Let's go straight into our first story, though. Andy Burnham, in his speech today, which was the first he's really given, to set out his stall and his potential policy agenda since it became clear that he would be the next Prime Minister. So there were lots and lots of people very interested in what he had to say. And we're going to show you a number of segments from the speech. First, this is what he thinks has gone wrong in Britain over the past 2 decades.
After 10 years of political turbulence since Brexit, and 20 years of falling living standards since the 2008 financial crash, Westminster hasn't been working for people, and it hasn't been working for a very long time. In fact, it is broken. And as a result, the country isn't where it should be. It is stuck in a rut, and clearly we can't go on like this. My generation of politicians, including me, must take responsibility. We haven't been good enough.
So he says we haven't been good enough. He says it's sort of clear that he includes himself in that, especially when he was a minister. I don't think he blames himself for his period as mayor of Manchester, which he seems sort of very proud of from beginning to end. So what was his solution?
We need a new determination to raise living standards of every single person in this land. And we must accept that, to do that, to fix the economy and the country, we need to change politics, and we need to do it now. So let me state my clear intention as I put myself forward. True to the motto of this city, I am going to do things differently. I am going to break with the more of the same approach that has got us here. I am going to give Britain the circuit breaker it needs. By building a more collaborative politics in Westminster, by taking power out of the centre and putting it in the hands of the people and places who can use it best.
So that's Burnham's answer. He can fix British politics by taking power in Westminster and then giving that power away. That, we were told, will involve much more meaningful devolution than we've seen up to now to the nations and the regions. And it will also include a new outpost of number 10 Downing Street in Manchester, which Burnham is calling number 10 North.
Ours will be a 10-year mission to raise living standards across the land. To do this, number 10 North will support the regions on 3 clear tasks: reform of essential utilities, reindustrialisation, and the regeneration of places.
So on utilities, Burnham said he wanted all parts of the UK to be able to take greater control of essential services, though he didn't say whether that would include full nationalisation. On investment, he said the rules Whitehall uses to decide on procurement and investment would be changed to include social value as well as financial value. He said that would favour British firms and also places outside of London. Interestingly, he suggested mayors could help get down the welfare bill by getting young people into apprenticeships and work. And this seemed like a pretty significant commitment.
Britain's housing crisis is having a ruinous impact on its public finances. So, working with local areas, Number 10 North will oversee the biggest council house building programme since the post-war period.
So in the post-war period, Britain would regularly build over 150,000 council homes a year. So if we could get anywhere close to that figure, it would be absolutely transformational. Of course, to actually meet the target he set there, he'd presumably only need to build more than have been built per year since 1970, because he's saying since the post-war period, not since the war. In the 1980s, the average was 40,000 a year, though it's declined throughout the decade, so ended up a lot lower than that. Under New Labour, this is just a phenomenal statistic. Only 562 council homes were built per year. So there were a few housing associations that were building houses at the same time, but again, not in anywhere near to the degree that social homes were built in the post-war period. In the speech, Burnham also said he would reform business rates to benefit pubs and high street shops. He said he would make high streets the symbol of Britain's new renaissance. So, do we finally know now what Andy Burnham stands for and what an Andy Burnham government would do? Well, earlier today, I spoke to economist, host of the Macrodose podcast and friend of the show, James Meadway.
We know some of it. He ducked out of deliberately the fairly major question about who his Chancellor of the Exchequer will be. I mean, when the choice is between, broadly speaking, Ed Miliband, West Streeting, Shabana Mahmood, I mean, this is quite a spread of opinion inside the Labour Party, to say the least. So, you know, it matters a fair bit who ends up getting that job. A lot of the other stuff have been trailed really over the last week or so. The Number 10, the North, you know, most of the newspapers, I think, had this ahead of the speech. It may or may not be something. It's a nice idea. It's a headline grabber. It's whether it actually has any power. I mean, bear in mind, bits of the Treasury have been theoretically decamped, I think, Darlington, under Boris Johnson. It hasn't really made very much difference to what the Treasury's doing. So whether you get beyond the symbolism of some of this stuff and into the real meat of like what he's going to deliver, it's still not very clear. And like I say, I don't expect it to become clear perhaps until he's Prime Minister. The other one is that, look, it's all very well talking about, we've got 10 years to improve living standards and all the rest of it. We don't have 10 years to improve living standards. The cost of living crisis is right now, and it's going to get worse right now. You know, new figures out from Joseph Rowntree Foundation today show just how bad the shock of the Iran war has been to most households in terms of how much money it's going to cost them. If you then look at some of the projections for food prices on the back of the Iran war, El Nino this year, harvest failures, other sort of things that we're now starting to see more and more frequently, this is all happening already. You can't wait around 10 years and maybe he'll deliver. So the real question, Andy Burnham, is whether he's going to bring anything up front that addresses the problems people have right now, not kind of quite nice big picture stuff for a decade's time.
And I suppose he's remained non-committal on issues such as that as yet. The thing he has been sort of talking about very consistently is devolution. That seems to be the one sort of guiding principle he has at the moment. And it's sort of the issue that it sounds nice, and so everyone agrees with it. I haven't really heard anyone sort of dare to go on the radio over the past few days and say, actually, devolution's a terrible idea. Power should remain centralised in Westminster. I imagine some people behind closed doors are saying that. But I wondered if I could sort of get you from a economist perspective or political economy perspective or whatever perspective you prefer, to sort of take us back to first principles. Why is devolution such a good thing? Why would devolution be the difference that Britain might need?
It's the flip side of something Andy Burnham, to his credit really, has picked up on, which is this centralisation of power in Whitehall, and in particular in the Treasury, and then in particular in the way the Treasury makes decisions about who gets government investment spending, and the way the Treasury decides this. And there's plenty enough academic evidence on this. In fact, you can just see it. Just go to the rest of the country outside bits of London, the South East, you can see, you know, we have Crossrail in London, that's great. You do not have Northern Powerhouse rail build. You do not have any number of public transport promises that have been made over many years actually being delivered. And the fundamental problem there is the way the Treasury sees the world goes, okay, we have economic growth here. We can put a little bit more investment in here and we'll get a little bit more growth, and that's good enough. It doesn't think about what we're going to do for the rest of the country outside of that kind of golden triangle, so-called, of like London, Oxford, Cambridge, that it tends to think about. So that's the issue of devolution. The fundamental bit here is you try and say, how do we get more power and resources into the hands of people in the rest of the country so they can do something with it? And that's the big prize that is waiting there to be grabbed. And I'm pretty sure that in Burnham's case, he's been influenced by one of his economic advisors. He's just announced Lord Jim O'Neill, former Goldman Sachs chief economist, who, God, a decade ago was saying that devolution could deliver another £80 billion on GDP for the rest of the country if you do it right. So I think he's swayed by some of this, and presumably, of course, also his experiences Mayor of Greater Manchester.
But what's the difference between, say, Scotland and Wales? Because we have the Barnett formula, right, which means that they have a guaranteed proportion of government expenditure which goes to Scotland and goes to Wales, and they get to decide how to spend it on health and education. I know, especially on education, Wales has had a worse performance than England. It doesn't seem like a silver bullet.
Well, it's not. I mean, look, part of the problem here is that you have fairly deep-seated failures across the whole country, that just saying to a local authority, hey, for example, this is floated in the speech, you can keep more of the business rates that you get here. Well, that's kind of nice if you're a place that, I live in Tower Hamlets. It's nice if you're Tower Hamlets because you've got like Canary Wharf churning out huge sums in business rates so it can pay for a load of stuff in Tower Hamlets. It does nothing whatsoever if I cross over the road from my house and go to Hackney, right? So there's a real problem when you devolve some of these things without mechanisms for redistribution. You don't solve some of the underlying problems. The interesting bit, I think, about what Andy Burnham and people around him are talking about, and he says this in the speech, is he wants to talk about devolution from the ground up. So the model in England over the last few years, I think pretty inadvertently, done for bad political reasons, initially by George Osborne, was to basically hand over bits and pieces of power piecemeal to new city combined authorities and mayors in the rest of the country. And gradually they built up the power that they can do. So Andy Burnham famously brought buses back under public control of the local authorities so that, buses work much better now in Greater Manchester than they did 10 years ago, for example. So you can still see how a model of devolution where you give bits and pieces of more powers to local authorities on the ground who are very close to what's happening. There isn't just the sort of slightly mechanical Barnett formula, centralised redistribution mechanism you have. You can make a case that this is putting local authorities and city mayors, everybody else, closer to what's happening on the ground, give me enough powers to make a difference, and then they can actually start to deliver some of that, that big potential that's out there.
Isn't the inequality point key, though? And is there not a tension here? Because as far as I understand it, the real argument where devolution really brings about growth is if cities or regions, they can raise their own revenue and then they can spend their own revenue. And that gives them a massive incentive to say, businesses, come here, developers, build here. Basically, it empowers people who want to build and grow and disempowers NIMBYs because you have sort of these local authorities who want investment to come in and therefore they're focused on it. That's what you have in sort of China or I think the USA as well. But then you have a tension with inequality because then if you've given essential services to these local authorities and the businesses really want to go to Greater Manchester, but they don't want to go to the West Midlands, then sort of that challenges the universal basis of our welfare system. So is that an irresolvable tension and we just have to make a decision?
I think that, look, you highlight something important. And actually, this is, ironically, I have a memory of Andy Burnham as health secretary way back in the day in 2009, objecting to devolution inside our health and social care provision on precisely that grounds, right? That if you devolve these powers to, for example, city regions and mayors in somewhere like Greater Manchester, you end up with inequality of provision. That's what he said as health secretary. As Mayor of Greater Manchester, he's flipped that entirely on its head and said it's good to have that kind of local control over public health, for instance, and potentially over social care and the provision you can make and all sort of thing. So there's a gain to be had about having public power and authority close to the people who are going to be on the receiving end of it. And most people's contact with government is basically local government in the first instance. It's local authorities who pick up your bins. It's local authorities who do a load of stuff you see on a day-to-day basis. So the idea that they'll be close to people who elect them and you can see straight away what's happening is quite a powerful one by itself. The challenge is that redistribution element. And the real challenge, I think, is getting the scale right. Like you could, in theory, inside of Greater Manchester, go, well, we've had all these skyscrapers being built in the middle of the city. And if you go to Manchester, it's quite impressive, right? You can see what's happened in the last, by now, 2 decades. What you're not seeing is that redistributed properly to somewhere like Wigan, where I'm from, right? So you have a lot of concentration over there, not much done being in the outer boroughs. And you can see the political impact of that, which is why a bunch of people are voting reform. I think it's a large part of a criticism here. So it's not just redistribution on a countrywide basis, it's also what's going to happen in these city regions. That if you get someone who, like Andy Burnham, will talk up the successes of Manchester, and they are basically real enough, right? These are real things that happened, but there are real problems around inequality in Manchester itself. That's also a problem when you have a devolved system. It's also a problem inside the areas that you devolve power to. So it's always going to be this tension. If you have fundamentally an economy that is geared towards producing inequality, you're going to run into inequality being produced. And there's always a kind of political fight about how you resolve that.
And if you can sort of help me understand also what Burnham might mean when he talks about more public control over utilities, because obviously the example he keeps pointing to is the buses, but the buses have been brought from a sort of completely deregulated system to a regulated one, so sort of a deregulated system to something like TfL that we have in London. Now, from my perspective, water is already very regulated. It's just not nationalised. But he seems to be saying he's going to bring water into public control without nationalisation. And in a way, isn't that what we've already got and it's not working very well?
Well, you can tighten up. I mean, you can put more screws on what water companies do. You can start to say things like, well, look, you have massive environmental problems now and bearing down you in the future. You're going to have to carry the costs of that. And by the way, if you do that, you're pretty rapidly fined. If you had water companies carry the true costs of providing for climate change and the impact on water supplies that this will produce over the next however many decades, these companies will be insolvent. And then you could maybe go off and nationalise them. And there are proposals around that one way to bring things back in-house is just wait for these water companies to fail, perhaps helped along a bit with your increased regulation and greater public control, then you bring them in-house. But you do hit on something important here, by the way, which is worth somewhat underlining, because I think Andy Burnham, people around him, can be a little bit slippery on this, which is that, he didn't actually nationalise the buses in Greater Manchester. That isn't what happened. Like, you have a franchising system with the council, the combined authority, the mayor, setting what those buses can do, but it's still private providers underneath it, like we have with Transport for London here. It's been an improvement because it is more public control. It's not public ownership.
And I know your think tank, Verdant, you say it's sort of green aligned, but you're up for sort of giving anyone advice who's interested. You're also, you stood as a Green councillor, and I think it's interesting for our audience to think about, what would you be advising Zach Polansky at this point? Because obviously Andy Burnham really wants to win back a bunch of people who've left the Labour Party to go to the Greens. What would you be telling Zach Polansky he should be talking about at the moment?
I think, to be honest with you, I actually think he's got just about right. I mean, this is possibly a predictable answer, but I think it is actually the true one, which is to, in the case today with the speech, say, look, it's good that you're talking about these things, but you have to actually deliver for people. You need to deliver on the cost of living crisis right now. That will involve, on some level, more redistribution than Andy Burnham will talk about. Where is the wealth tax in what Andy Burnham says? Where's even something that Streeting is proposed, which is equalising capital gains taxes and income taxes? Some of the people around him, Lou Haig, has also talked about this, so maybe it'll come in. Maybe Ed Miliband as Chancellor, it starts to happen. But that, I think, is where the Green Party needs to be. There's a whacking great list of things that Andy Burnham, who presents, I think, a pretty compelling, perhaps quite familiar criticism of British capitalism and its problems over the last 40-odd years, the period of neoliberalism. One lots of people watching will recognise it's short-term, it doesn't invest, it's privatised. It's not addressing the problems we face today, which, for example, are fairly new, like the fact we're getting really bad heat waves and they're happening more often. So what are you going to do about that? How do you address the injustices that caused it? Where is Andy Burnham saying we need a maximum working temperature, for example, something the Green Party has rightly called for and something that will make a real difference to people otherwise having to suffer in the extreme heat we're now getting? I'm not seeing that from Burnham, and that, I think, is the space where the Green Party can get into.
Yeah, I mean, that's not accidental from Burnham, right, though? It seems like a conscious decision. How is he going to bring together sort of a broad enough coalition and get business on side and get the bond markets on side? And it's to focus less on redistribution and more on a sort of balanced state-led form, well, not necessarily state-led, but balanced growth where the state has a big role. That's the plan. It's not really a redistributionary project. And I suppose, are you surprised that I suppose what I'm asking you is, it's saying focus more on redistribution. There's a reason he's not doing that, right? It's not as simple as he could just say yes.
He could do. I mean, he's got a fairly wide space to do all sorts of things. I mean, kind of, we're all working on a basis he's going to be prime minister, and by this point, I think it's not quite all over bar the shouting, but he's pretty much there. He's got a majority of 400 odd or whatever it was Labour got last time. You can, in the British parliamentary system, do a lot with that. Now, that isn't the only way power operates. There'll be all sorts of pressures on you to change course and to do other things. But you do, at least in theory, have that parliamentary majority, and I'd suggest pretty strong public support for some measures. He is talking about redistribution in some senses, is redistribution of power. If he follows through on what he's saying, that implies a hefty redistribution of power. The gamble that he's making, and I think it's a better gamble than the one that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves made, which was like, hey, we're the grown-ups, we'll be in charge, growth will return as a result. The gamble that Burnham and the people around him are making is that if you redistribute power, this will also unlock some of the growth potential that's out there in the rest of the country outside London and the southeast, and that will be enough to start turning things around for us, and then it'll all start to work, and then we don't really need to talk so much about redistribution of wealth taxes and other things that the Greens have focused on in recent months.
James Meadway, thank you so much for joining us again on Novara Media.
Thank you.
That was James Meadway speaking to me about Andy Burnham. Later in the show, we'll have Zoran Mamdani on Andy Burnham. Obviously, last week, we had Jeremy Corbyn on Andy Burnham. Pleased to say that interview is doing very well. I think about 140,000 people have watched it so far. If you haven't yet, do check it out. Get some of his insights into his experience working with Andy Burnham. Of course, he's worked with Burnham and Keir Starmer, so I was asking him what he thinks the difference between them is. I have to say, he was actually, well, was I surprised? He was more positive about Andy Burnham than I was expecting him to be. He seems relatively relaxed and pleased about him becoming Labour leader. That was my interpretation anyway. You can have a watch of it and see if you have a different takeaway. Let's move on to Iran. The shaky ceasefire between the US and Iran has come under more pressure as tit-for-tat strikes that began last week continued into the weekend. And the fresh fighting broke out on Thursday when Iran attacked a cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz. Now, they did that because they believe the ceasefire agreement with the United States gives them sole control over the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, is the only bargaining chip they have against getting invaded again by the Americans. That ship that they attacked had been traveling via a route opened in Oman's waters in the strait, so outside of Iran's official control, which was much to the chagrin of the Iranians. The United States then responded by hitting what it said were missile and drone stashes inside Iran, as well as radar facilities, releasing this grainy footage, which it said was of the attacks. After that, in a post on his Truth Social platform, Trump said this: a United States aircraft just struck Iranian missile and drone storage locations and coastal radar sites for violating the ceasefire agreement. Again, it is very possible that they will never learn. There may come a point when we are no longer able to be reasonable and will be forced to militarily complete the job that we very successfully started. If that happens, the Islamic Republic of Iran will no longer exist. President Donald J. Trump. Obviously, a president saying another country will no longer exist, that would once upon a time have been shocking. Now it's sort of just by-the-by daily occurrence. Iran, it appears, though, didn't particularly like that post. They haven't quite come to be at peace with Donald Trump repeatedly threatened to destroy their entire civilization. And just a few hours later, they launched missiles at US military sites in Kuwait and Bahrain. And as you can see from these images, a residential building in Bahrain's capital, Manama, was also badly damaged in what the government there said was an Iranian drone strike. And you can see a top-floor apartment almost completely destroyed. Bahrain's government called the attack sinful Iranian aggression, though they said there were no casualties. Now, at this point, of course, it looked like another fragile ceasefire in West Asia was about to completely unravel. But today, in a whiplash-inducing change in tone, Donald Trump has posted this. Iran has requested a meeting. It will take place tomorrow in Doha. President DJT. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said Trump's envoys Steve Witkoff, who is a real estate mogul, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, will lead the US delegation. Barry, I think sort of since that first ceasefire deal and the end of the sort of more intense fighting between the Americans, the Iranians, Israel, many people have sort of taken their focus off what's going on because, if I'm honest, it seems a bit repetitive. There's this agreement, then someone breaks it, then they make an agreement again, then someone breaks it, and sort of all the while it seems like quite a low-level conflict that might go on for a really long time. What's your interpretation of the current state of play?
Well, firstly, I think that the fact that Iran made a decision to attack a cargo ship in the Strait of Hormuz at this point is really, really interesting for a couple of reasons. Why did they think that they could make that calculation? They've shown that they are not, with that strike, they've shown that they are not afraid to begin military action, right? That they are not responding all the time, but they will launch a strike that they know full well that the US will respond to. I think that is really interesting. And you wonder whether it is that the Iranians have kind of calculated that any response from the US or even Israel will be quite measured, quite calculated in its own way, because they know that for Trump, restarting all-out war is potentially quite damaging for him. And it also shows the key thing is that they are not letting go of, as you said, that massive lever that they have, which is their effective control over the Strait of Hormuz. So what Oman did, as you said, was Oman got together with the International Maritime Organization to kind of put forward this alternative route. So if you look at the strait, you have Oman on one side and you have Iran on the other side. And effectively, their territorial waters are kind of cut in half almost. And so Oman and the IMO were saying, you can go through the Strait of Hormuz if you just come really close to the Oman coast and sneak away. And Iran said, nah, you are not doing that. And they made clear that you cannot do that with the drone strike on this, I believe it was a Singaporean vessel. I wonder about Oman. Oman is kind of the Switzerland of the region. It's always put itself forward as a mediator. So I don't know if Iran kind of miscalculated here or if it was strong-armed somehow into doing this. It seems clear that if tankers had started to pass through this alternative route, then you're taking sort of Iran's big lever off the table, right? It's firmly back on the table, I think, with this attack. And now you're looking at the talks starting on Tuesday, and Iran will continue to go into the talks with the Strait of Hormuz in its back pocket because it launched this drone strike effectively. So I think that the drone strike served its purpose.
And it's a gamble that presumably has paid off, right? Because Iran is thinking, if Oman and the International Maritime Organization, if they just sort of set up this alternative route through the Strait and Iran doesn't respond, then their leverage is gone. But obviously, drone striking a Singaporean ship, there's some risks involved in that. But they've said, well, that's worth it. We're going to call the Americans bluff. And the Americans, their response is quite weak. Donald Trump sends an angry tweet. There's a couple of drone strikes at military targets. So it's sort of Iran saying, we're actually not scared of the Americans. We're going to control the Strait. Right?
Yeah, because they know that Trump doesn't want all-out war again, or they calculate that he doesn't. And clearly, they've also calculated that these constant posts on Truth Social, these constant threats that have sometimes been genocidal threats, right? We're going to wipe out the entire Iranian nation. We're going to wipe out the Iranian people. They clearly think that a lot of that is hot air. He said it time and time and time again. And again, they were proven right because, as you say, it was a fairly muted response. A few missile sites, a few drone sites, some radar facilities. I mean, nothing was done to take away Iran's capability to hit ships in the Strait. And that includes ships sailing close to the coast of Oman because also, it's really small, the Strait of Hormuz. It's not like you can sneak past without Iran seeing you. So yeah, Iran goes into the talks now with the same old lever it had, which is super, super effective, which is the one that Trump and the US and Netanyahu and the Israelis should have seen coming. Because we've actually had this before. I think we've discussed this before. 10, 15 years ago, there have been other crises where Iran has threatened to close the strait. But it was always considered this insanely extreme thing that could never, ever happen. I remember a report from, I want to say it's more than 10 years ago, where there was some analysts suggesting that Iran could resort to closing the strait. And I remember a Saudi official kind of like poo-pooing it, like laughing at the notion, saying there's no way on earth they would do that. Hey, if Iran thinks it can close the Strait of Hormuz, then I can sell the Empire State Building to you, this Saudi guy said to one journalist. But the difference this time was that Iran, the Iranian government, was fighting for its life. The Iranian government was backed into a corner. It was going to pull out absolutely all the stops. The crazy thing I think about the Strait of Hormuz situation is that Iran didn't formally control the strait. It still doesn't formally control the strait, right? Because it's against international law to take control of an international waterway. But the war has given them what I would call effective control over the waterway. The whole world has understood the damage that Iran can do by blocking the strait. And so I actually think that if we do come to a lasting peace deal here, Iran is going to come out the other end with more control over the Strait of Hormuz than it ever had before. So it's like, you see in the US, there's a debate about, people criticize Trump and they say, well, now he's fighting to put things back the way they were before this was started. I don't think he's even going to get that far.
Oh, yeah. Iran are going to have way more leverage after this than they had before, which is why, potentially, this is all looking quite bad for Donald Trump at home, with midterms, of course, on the way. God, they'll be exciting. The war on Iran is causing havoc for Trump within his own party. So this is from the New York Times. Both US support of Israel and the war with Iran continue to cause fissures inside the Republican Party, and particularly within President Trump's Make America Great Again movement. Isolationists who hailed Mr. Trump's campaign promise to avoid foreign wars say they feel betrayed by his intervention in Iran and the domestic consequence, spiking prices. Recently, another front has emerged against the president. Now that he is negotiating with Iran, he faces backlash from hawks within the party who believe he did not achieve his goal of crippling the country's military and nuclear capabilities, let alone end its hardline regime. Obviously, it's a situation which has cost billions to the global economy. Lots of people have died. It's a serious matter, invading a sovereign country. But the outcome, having sort of pissed off absolutely everyone, is quite entertaining, right? Is it that this is an outcome that hasn't pleased anyone whatsoever? Because if you think stupid wars in the Middle East shouldn't happen, then he started the war. If you're a kind of hawk who thinks that America should be the global hegemon and it should be able to push countries in West Asia around and tell them what to do, then you're also not going to like this. So it's a real sweet spot or a sour spot, I suppose, that has pleased no one.
Yeah, he's getting it from all sides. In a way, it's kind of satisfying. As the New York Times said, you have one side going, "What are you doing? You never should have invaded Iran. This was not a MAGA project. I thought we were going to be isolationist. I thought we were going to avoid all these wars." And then you have the hawks going, "What a crappy war you just ran." The Iranian government still exists, right? And I think that was the key thing. And that, by the way, that was the key thing for Benjamin Netanyahu. When Netanyahu strong-armed Trump into this war, because that's what happened. What Netanyahu wanted was the Islamic Republic destroyed. That's what he wanted. And it turned out that the Islamic Republic was a hell of a lot more entrenched and resilient than anybody, well, certainly than the US and the Israelis imagined. And it's very hard to see it going anywhere now. It's survived. And so, while, yes, the Iranian government has been weakened, and while, yes, they have lost a lot of military capacity, and let's always mention here that a lot of Iranian civilians have been killed, I think that the Iranian government are going to come out the other end of this feeling like they've won. And I think the key thing is, because they've survived, and I think that the key thing is Americans seem to know that too. We always have, I lived in the US for a while. You have this thing where we in Europe, we kind of scoff at Americans and we say, they don't know anything about the world. They don't even, many of them don't even have passports. And then you go to the US. And when I went there, it started to really strike me. It's very difficult to learn about the world in the US because the media is just so parochial. So parochial. There's such little good foreign coverage, but also there's such flag waving sort of devotees to, America's the world's policeman and stuff. But I think what's interesting here is that an alternative message has broken through with the US public. And I think that we've seen that in polls, we've seen that in interviews where they think that this was a pointless war. They are very aware of how much money it's cost. They've seen prices rise. And guess what? They don't blame the big bad Iranians for this. They blame Donald Trump. And I said on this show millions of times we've discussed this. The midterms are coming. The midterms are coming. And I think I said once that probably July might be the kind of deadline to wrap this up, because I think that July is when, what are we, a couple of days away from July. July is when you really see campaigning for the midterms like kick into high gear. And with this roundly unpopular war, the polls are showing right now that the Democrats will take the Congress, which would be a huge defeat for Trump. Senate, way more difficult to flip, but there's an outside chance the Senate could flip. If that happens, then Trump, in terms of pushing any kind of a domestic agenda through, is really hampered. And so, here's the thing right now. The midterms are the check on Trump. The American voters are the check on Trump. Trump said a few months ago that the only check against him was his own morality. And he still has control of the Republican Party, for all the criticism from Republicans about the war. He still has effective control of that party. But it's the voters, it's the midterms, that's the check. And that's what could bring the war on Iran to an end. But he's going to have to come out with some kind of, and this is when we look at the talks that are starting on Tuesday, what Trump is going to, while he wants the war to end, what he's going to want to come out with is something that he can save face with. He's going to need to go to the American electorate and say, we got ABC, it wasn't all pointless. Or he's in for a drubbing.
We're going to come back to the midterms a bit later in the show, actually, because there have been some interesting primary results from New York. And before that, we got a story closer to home. It's long been known that white working class pupils are being left behind at school. And it's a phenomenon for which people have put forward many different explanations. There were a couple of years where right-wingers wrung their hands over the falling attainment of white working class boys, which they said had been put off by woke teaching that favoured girls. Increasingly, the right is now using the social and educational neglect of children in that group to power their narrative that Britain is awash with anti-white racism. I would say those explanations are a reach. The poor outcomes, though, they're seeking to explain are very real. Now, that's according to the results of a recent inquiry, independent of the government, so sort of set up by a charity and Public First. It was chaired by former Education Secretary Estelle Morris and former Ofsted Chair Hamid Patel. The statistics that it sort of includes are pretty striking. So of pupils on free school meals, so this is sort of people who are equal in terms of their incomes to some degree, of people on free school meals from all large ethnic groups in the UK, white British children have the worst outcomes. You've got Irish travellers and Gypsy, Roma and travellers below them, but they're quite small groups. So the big groups, white British children on free school meals are doing the worst, and with only a third of them attaining a grade 4 or higher in English and maths GCSEs. So what's behind the low attainment of white working class kids? Well, this was Estelle Morris speaking to the BBC.
I think what's happened over the years is that the communities from which these children come, they want the best for the children. They're ambitious, they're aspirational. They want them to have good jobs. They want them to have happy and fulfilling lives. And there's a disconnect between what they want for their children and what they think school is giving their children.
Some other figures in the report are fairly stark. So this is on suspensions. As you can see here, 42% of white working class boys will face suspension or exclusion at some point. Really high figure. 30% of white working class girls are also likely to face some form of suspension. I think this can also be internal suspension, so it can be sort of being sent to isolation for a day or so. But that is 4 times the rate of white students who aren't on free school meals. So that's sort of the class divide. It's also double the rate of non-white people on free school meals. That's where there seems to be this particular problem with white working class students. Absence is also a major issue. So 40% of white working class kids are persistently absent from school. That's 3 times the rate of white kids who aren't on free school meals. and a third higher than non-white kids on free school meals. There also appears to be a misalignment between how working class communities understand success in education compared to the schools that kids are going to. This is from the Inquiry. They report this. For many white working class families, multi-generational experience has weakened the perceived link between education and success in later life. The curriculum is often experienced by white working class pupils and parents as disconnected from their lived realities and future opportunities. For many white working class families, the social experience of school and college is as important as its academic purpose. Enrichment and extracurricular activities are highly valued by white working class families, but are not consistently accessible through schools and colleges. The report makes a number of recommendations, among them that the government should define working class for the purposes of education. So I suppose here we're using the proxy of being entitled to free school meals. So potentially they're saying we could have a more nuanced or sort of fuller definition of that. And it calls for some big economic interventions, including extending the availability of 30 hours of free childcare to all disadvantaged families, not just those with a working parent. So that's interesting, actually. So you're only entitled to that if you've got a parent at work, because the idea is that if the parent isn't at work, then they can look after the kid. But obviously, quite a lot of child development happens at childcare. So for the sake of the kid, it's good to give the 33 hours childcare to everyone. It also says this, improving white working class educational outcomes will require more than school reform alone. It will require a long-term national effort involving schools, families, employers, further and higher education institutions, community organisations, funders, civic institutions, and government itself. It will require rebuilding trust between schools and families and restoring wider community infrastructure. It will also require investment in local economies and sustained action to create high-quality jobs, to ensure that children and young people can see visible and credible opportunities within the places they call home. All the evidence in the report points to multi-generational disengagement from school, triggered in part by the sense that education won't lead to opportunities in the places where people live, because there often aren't many opportunities in those places, nor are there the teachers. So the report references the difficulties schools in traditionally white disadvantaged areas have in recruiting and retaining good quality staff. Barry, lots of these statistics are quite stark, and I suppose do cut against lots of, again, I should be clear here, the reason white working class students are underperforming isn't because of sort of people on the left and liberals talking about white privilege, but it does, to some extent, complicate that narrative.
Yeah, well, the statistics are shocking. I mean, I feel like I knew that was a problem, but when I read some of the statistics today, I was pretty shocked. Yeah, I think you're right. I actually think there was kind of a taboo on the left on talking about this for a while, and that taboo is there because the right wing were weaponizing it to say that the system was somehow racist against white children, and that's why white working class children were at the bottom of the pile. Of course, that's nonsense. The system is not racist against white children. And I think that there was also this argument that people would make on the left where they would say, you know, when you talk about white working class, you're trying to exclude non-white working class people from the conversation. And the only way to tackle this is in an intersectional manner, etc. But I'm glad that this is being talked about, and I'm glad that it's being focused on, because I think it's very possible to focus in on an individual community and address the particularities of that community, whether it's a white community or any non-white community. And clearly the statistics don't lie. They show that there's a massive problem. I think for me, one of the things that really stood out, and you had just highlighted, was the kind of the multi-generational aspect of this like persistent multi-generational aspect where, you know, many generations do not stay for their A levels maybe, or do not go on to university or college or further education. And it's actually something I've seen in practice a little bit. So when I was growing up, I had a friend called Michelle. Hello, Michelle. And she was studying science at one of Dublin's top universities. No, actually Ireland's most prestigious university. That's Trinity College. She came from a very, very disadvantaged background and had known nobody else who had gone to university. But she found her way to Trinity College. What she used to do is she used to go back to the school that she went to and talk to the children about the fact she went there in an attempt to kind of model the fact that it is possible to go to this school and come from this neighborhood and go to university, because I think that's like a really key thing. You have children from white working class backgrounds, obviously, and from other working class backgrounds who don't have any example. They don't see any route, and they don't make the link between school and the future. I saw that in my own school. I went to a school that was primarily made up of, was a boys' school, and it was overwhelmingly white and working class. And I saw kids in my school who, again, they just could not make that link between what's happening here in the classroom and your potential for the future. It had never been communicated to them in any way, shape, or form. I also did some volunteer reading helping at school in London, and the teachers told me the same thing, that, the kids who were falling behind in reading, it was never articulated to them at home that reading had any importance, or they were never given the space to read. And by the way, that is not a criticism of the parents of those children. It's what I'm trying to highlight is that it's been going on through generations, and their parents don't even understand the root, right? I also read a brilliant book recently called Estates: An Intimate History by Lindsay Hanley, which I fully recommend. So essentially it's a history of council housing in the UK. And Lindsay Hanley grew up in a council estate, and she talks about her experience growing up and how, she was like hungry for learning, and she got her way to university, but like the massive challenges that she had. And again, it was like a cultural thing. I remember she had this sort of phrase where she said, she was talking about working class people being like ghettoized in estates and having, no glimpse of the horizon. And I remember she said in the book that it's hard to keep up with the Joneses when there are no Joneses to keep up with. So yes, it's great to have money released or whatever that measure was for childcare. That's great. But there's also like a very targeted local level intervention that's needed to open people's eyes to opportunity. Otherwise, it's just going to continue to persist generation to generation and get worse and worse.
There's an interesting conversation going on in the comments because which sort of, I think, represents how some of the debate has been sort of inconsistent over the past few years. So Mally Wright says, it's culture. Instant gratification over delayed gratification is almost always favoured in white working class families. And then someone else has said, Phil has said, you would never say that about black kids. And I think it's interesting that sort of the default on the left has been to say, if there is a group of non-white people who are having worse outcomes than white people, that must be structural racism. And if there's a group of white people who are having worse outcomes than non-white people, that must be the fault of the white people. And it's like there is this real inconsistency where it's structural racism if white people are doing better, and it's personal failings if white people are doing worse. And I mean, my stance generally now is let's move away from sort of assuming everything is about. I don't think the white working class kids are doing bad because of racism, but I also think that if you're going to say a disparity doesn't imply, a disparate outcome doesn't imply racism, you have to be sort of consistent with that.
Yeah, that's that, and I said at the beginning that this has been kind of a taboo on the left, and I think it's because arguments like that break out. But again, pointing it to being sort of not a cultural thing, but a structural thing or a generational thing. If you look at the other stats and you see, people from the working class Chinese community or the working class Indian or Bengali community or whoever who are doing way, way better than children from white working class communities, I think, that is obviously partly down to a belief in those communities that education is important and an articulation to children in those communities of the link between education and your future, which again, reading books like Lindsay Hanley and other accounts from white working class people does not seem to be a message that is sent as frequently in white working class communities or white working class families. So we have to explore why that is. And again, that's why I'm saying, you can release money and that's great, but you need some targeted educational ground level intervention also. to shift that culture there?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting question. It's also like, I mean, clearly it's got something to do with geography. So it has been the case that over the past, I mean, especially since New Labour, basically it used to be the case that inner city schools were the worst schools and now they're kind of the best schools. I mean, partly because cities became more attractive to live and so sort of the best teachers wanted to move there. Also because of particular programs that particularly New Labour introduced. That means that now sort of the schools that get the best results compared to sort of the demographics of the people who are coming to them. So the schools who are basically going to get the best results for working class kids are now in major cities. And that didn't used to be the case. And then also it's probably going to be to do, there's a cultural issue there, which is that you'll often have immigrant communities who are cash poor, but have a lot of cultural capital because they might, from where they came from, they might have been middle class and very well educated. They come here, they're cash poor, so they're entitled to free school meals. But they have sort of the attributes as a family of a middle class family.
Exactly.
Because they bring that cultural capital with them. Very interesting. I'm sure we'll come back to this topic in the future. Let's go to our final story. New York Mayor Zoran Mamdani is well known for his love of football, so it's no surprise that he turned up on BBC 5 Live's Football Daily to talk all things World Cup. Of course, I presume that's because Football Daily was in New York for the World Cup. It wasn't long, though, before the topic of British politics came up.
When you won the mayor here, the mayor of Greater Manchester congratulated you in a tweet. He now could become the next Prime Minister of the UK. I'm interested, as a mayor of a city, and I know you can't be president as long as the rules stay as they are here, but what I'm interested in is, do you think the skills required to be a city mayor can easily be transferred nationally?
I don't think anything comes with ease at that kind of a level. I do think they're very important skills because many people have lost faith in government. The place that they earn that faith back or they decide to trust again is at the most local level. That's where they see what it can look like to have a government that delivers for them. And if you're able to respond to people, whether it's in Greater Manchester or New York City, it is at the heart of what people are looking for any kind of politics. So I wish him well. I don't think he's an Arsenal supporter, though.
No, he is. He's an Everton. He's an Everton supporter.
I mean, at least you can respect that someone has suffered. You know?
For a long time.
No,
right.
but like I like it when I meet someone who's a fan of a team that hasn't just won and won and won.
So the Burnham message there, I mean, was very interesting. Something that people sort of talking about a lot, which is, does being a mayor translate well to power? And I think there's one level on which it doesn't, in the sense that often in a major city, you are appealing to a different demographic than the whole country. Zoran Mamdani, a very left-wing guy, is appealing to New Yorkers who are generally sort of the most progressive people in America. So if he was to say, well, I've won in New York, so I'm then going to win in America, that's not necessarily going to work. Might do. I mean, he's a brilliant communicator. I don't think he couldn't be president, but it's definitely going to be harder. The other issue is, do you have to make the same set of decisions? So, I mean, I know more about the system in the UK, but Andy Burnham in Manchester didn't have to raise taxes, obviously didn't have to have a policy on immigration. He didn't have to make a lot of hard decisions, which he will have to make when he's in national government. But the point about sort of the closer connection people feel towards regional government mayors, I find very, very interesting. And sort of the reasons why that might be, I suppose, in a way, it's probably helpful to them that they get talked about less in the national media. Like, local politics is inherently less polarizing. It's much harder to do sort of like a culture war in a city. Obviously, people try it with Sadiq Khan, but no one really cares, right? Because none of the major newspapers are really going to run with it. Like, if it's closer to you, you feel warmer. Those national issues where you can sort of say, oh, these alien people elsewhere who voted Remain or who voted Leave, doesn't really work on the basis of a city. So maybe sort of in our polarized world, mayors will have sort of very promising future careers. Who knows? Let's go to some more news, though, coming out of New York when it comes to the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America. Of course, that's the group that Mamdani came from. Last week, Free Democratic Socialists beat their Democratic opponents in the New York primaries for the House of Representatives, meaning they, rather than establishment party members will be on the ballot for the Democratic Party in the midterms. Now, all three were publicly and repeatedly endorsed by Mamdani and ran on similar platforms to his. Each of them promised to abolish ICE, condemned Israel's genocide in Gaza, and pledged to tax the rich. If they win in November, they'll get seats in the US Congress. Now, those victories are a testament to the growing power of the Democratic Socialists within the Democratic Party, and with one of them, Brad Lander, even managing to unseat the sitting congressman for his district, Dan Goldman. Goldman is heir to the Levi Strauss fortunes, that's the jeans company. He received heavy backing from pro-Israel groups in the primary. He's also famous for leading the first impeachment inquiry against Donald Trump in 2019. None of that was enough to save him, and some centrist Democrats are very unhappy about the sudden upswing in the popularity of the DSA. Joe Walsh is a former Republican congressman who switched to the Democrats. He told The Guardian this about the threat the Democratic Socialists might pose. So he said, Democrats are giving Republicans a huge fucking gift. Republicans will do what I used to do. One crazy lefty says defund the police, and then Republicans and conservative media tag the whole party with defund the police. They're going to try to make the whole party out to be crazy, America-hating Democratic Socialists, and to a degree, it'll work. Others think the Democratic Socialists should form their own party. This was Congressman Josh Gottheimer speaking to CNN in the wake of those results.
This is my bigger concern, and I think the point here that socialists aren't Democrats. I think they're not interested in actually seeing the success of the Democratic Party, and they've attacked our leadership. And as you just quoted, Jake, right? I mean, some of the positions, many of the positions are nowhere near what we believe, right? I mean, no police, no borders, no prisons. It's that kind of rhetoric which obviously belongs in, and again, that's okay. That's their views, but it's in the Socialist Party, not in the Democratic Party.
On ABC, Mamdani was asked what he thought of comments like Gottheimer's.
And you're hearing some not just dismissive, though. There's resentment. And this is from fellow Democrats who think that this could jeopardize Democratic chances in the fall. I mean, you've got Josh Gottheimer, a Democratic member of Congress, says, many of us believe, as do I, if you're a socialist, you are not a Democrat. And in fact, they put out a manifesto today. I don't know, have you seen this thing?
Sounds pretty socialist to me.
It's not a communist manifesto. It's a moderate manifesto saying, we are capitalist, not socialist. We believe in a growing, fair, and competitive economy, entrepreneurship, ownership. I mean, this is a direct response, they've made it clear, to what you did here on Tuesday.
Well, I mean, that's great, but what's a party if not its voters? And I'm proud to sit in front of you as the mayor of our city, having received more than 1 million votes, a little less than a year ago. And when we're talking about these incredible congressional candidates, they won their races, and they won their races with a vision of what politics should be, and one that actually speaks to working people. And for a lot of people who ask themselves, what does democratic socialism mean? And you can tell them the answer at a theoretical level. It's the choice to extend democracy from the ballot box the rest of their lives. But in terms of what it means over these last 7 months, we've seen a city with democratic socialist principles at the heart of it within our administration. And what we've delivered has been record lows when it comes to murders and shootings.
So is it pragmatic democratic socialism?
I think democratic socialism at the heart is pragmatic, because if we cannot deliver for working people, then what is this for? I'm not interested in writing a manifesto or, frankly, in reading one. I'm interested in delivering, and that's exactly what we've been showing.
I mean, this early in his mayoralty, sort of record low murders and shootings, probably good luck. But anyway, obviously a very articulate answer, as always, from Mamdani. The DSA recently surpassed 100,000 members with active chapters in almost all 50 states. The group's co-chair, Ashik Sadiq, gave this explanation for its success. A big part of our task is diffusing many decades of propaganda from the Cold War and Red Scares in the United States that created a stigma around socialism. We're helping recover the American roots of socialism. We want to emphasize that this is not some foreign thing. The Soviet Union is not relevant at this point. It's been decades since that. Young people especially are not susceptible to the propaganda as much. Conditions are challenging for people who are millennials and younger. There's not a lot of faith in the existing system. They are much more receptive to the idea that capitalism is causing the problems of our society today, and there's a better way to organize how we live and work. And of course, the major elephant in the room has also become Israel, a country that was for decades beyond criticism in the United States. The loyalty to Israel has all but completely disappeared now amongst Democratic voters, and DSA candidates aren't afraid to harness that antagonism. Polling by the Pew Research Center shows that 80% of Americans who lean towards the Democrats have either a very or somewhat unfavorable opinion of Israel. Among Democrats under 50, that becomes 84%. And many of them see traditional Democrat politicians as heavily influenced by AIPAC, that's the pro-Israel lobbying group that funnels huge donations to candidates. As Politico put it in their headline announcing the New York DSA wins, pro-Israel politics took a massive hit in the city, which is especially significant given it's the home of the US's largest Jewish population. I think probably the world's largest Jewish population as well, definitely outside of Israel, but maybe even compared to any Israeli cities. It depends what the population
certainly
is
outside of Israel.
Of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
But I think it's over 1 million.
What you mean? Yeah.
Barry, what do you make of this? What's driving the success of the DSA in at least these sort of urban parts of America?
Wait, just before that, super interesting to hear people say socialism has been so demonized in the US, and then to look at that interview and realize that democratic socialism is even considered a massive boogeyman. And the interviewer saying, "Whoa, hold on, democratic socialism. Is it pragmatic democratic socialism?" It's that word that I think a lot of the people in the US who criticize it don't actually know what it means. It's so bloody controversial over
I think lots of people who use it. I mean, I say social democracy because we know what social democracy is, but obviously lots of people think that democratic socialism is different. But then I suppose it is. You are proposing something more radical than social democracy. Social democracy is the thing that we know, that we have this strong experience of. Anyway, I'm interrupting you. You continue.
Anyway, yeah, this is huge. I honestly think this is huge. I mean, look at the scalp of Dan Goldman. That's a huge, huge scalp. And actually, it sort of takes me back to AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who in 2018 came out of nowhere and took a massive scalp also, who at that time, I think it was Joseph Crowley, who people were talking about as the replacement for Nancy Pelosi as Democratic leader of the House. And there hadn't even been a primary challenge against Crowley since 2004. Nobody had bothered. And AOC unseated him in 2018. And so, what's happened with the Mamdani wave is not entirely new. AOC did it too. But to do it in 3 different primaries, I think is absolutely remarkable, especially when you look at the 3 candidates and realize that they're, that they would abolish ICE, that they're anti-genocide, they're avowed leftists. If you look at these 3 candidates, you could absolutely argue that they're more to the left than AOC is, and also they are now going to be running in New York, which is overwhelmingly a Democrat city. So, there's a very strong chance that people to the left of AOC are now going to end up in Congress. I mean, that's huge, right? That's potentially huge. And it's rattling the Democratic establishment so much. Like that quote that you read out there, but I saw another one today. This is from James Carville. James Carville is like a Democratic Party grandee who is actually, he's credited with getting Bill Clinton elected and crafting his campaign. He also worked for Hillary Clinton. He worked for John Kerry. He said, I actually wrote a bit of it down. He said, everybody's always said, no, we're a coalition, we're a big tent. And there's just some shit that I can't be in the same tent with. Let's negotiate a terms of a schism here. Maybe we can part under some kind of advantageous terms for both of us, but I'm done and I'm not in that fucking political party. So, it's like a full-on toys being thrown out of the pram all over the Democratic establishment. And I actually find that kind of beautiful. But the reason that I find it beautiful is like the democracy of it. Like look what's happened. People have bypassed the party machine and they've come up from the grassroots and they've been elected. I think we also face that problem in this country a little bit right now, where it's difficult sometimes for people to come through the grassroots and get selected because selection is controlled by the machinery of the party.
Well, in this country,
right?
James Carville could have just kicked them out of the party.
Well, exactly. Right? Or, yeah. And so we have career politicians, right? We're about to have a career politician come in as prime minister. The candidate who was pushing to be prime minister before him, Wes Streeting, is also a career politician. And, the selection that we've seen in the last few years, especially like Morgan Sweeney, Mandelson picked, are always like, the well-behaved people. And so to see this kind of democratic insurgency in New York, I think it's wonderful. And I wish we had more of that in the UK.
Yeah, we'd need different electoral laws, wouldn't we? Because the thing that they have in America is they have the primaries are sort of written into sort of state constitutions, or at least law, right? So here, what happens in the Labour Party is basically the business of the Labour Party, whereas in America, what happens in the Democratic Party isn't just the business of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, but then the issue here is that like local parties can find themselves sidelined when it comes to selection of candidates, right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. But but it's decided at the top. What I mean is that if someone tried a kind of Morgan McSweeney style thing in America, there would be lawsuits. Whereas in this country, if Morgan McSweeney wants to sort of move the rules to make sure you can't be an MP, you don't really have any redress, because what happens in the party stays in the party, essentially. Private association. Barry, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I'm going to watch the second half of Brazil versus Japan. Apparently Japan are winning.
Wow.
If you're not watching this live, you'll already know the result. If you didn't want to know the result because you wanted to watch the highlights without knowing, at least I've only told you what happened by the end of the first half. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.